everyone, welcome to a new video about linguistics. Today we are going to analyze the Krashen's hypothesis. The first one, that is acquisition learning. Our team are composed by Jessie, Fanny, Demian, Ale, and me, Kineret. So we hope that our work likes you, and well, let's see the video.
Stephen Krashen was born in May 14, 1941 in Chicago, Illinois, United States. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California, who moved from the Linguistics Department to the Faculty of the School of Education in 1994. He is a linguist, educational researcher, and political activist. Krashen has among papers and books more than 486 publications, contributing to the fields of second language acquisition, bilingual education, and reading. He is known for introducing various hypotheses related to second language acquisition, including the acquisition learning hypothesis, the input hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis, the affective filter, and the natural order hypothesis.
So now I'm going to talk about this. Let's get started. Well, according to Krashen, there are two ways of developing language ability: acquisition and learning. Krashen believes that there are two independent systems of second language performance: acquisition and learning. The distinction between acquisition and learning is one of the most influential theories among linguist researchers and practitioners. What is acquisition? Well, acquisition is a subconscious process that is very similar to the process children undergo when they acquire their first language. This process is focused on the meaning rather than the form. Also, it occurs passively and it happens informally and natural, for example, when people are relaxed. Now, I'm going to explain you what is learning. In short, learning is a conscious process that involves formal instruction that results in conscious knowledge about the language. Learning occurs actively through explicit or formal learning and instruction. This process is what occurs at the school. For example, when we talk about rules and grammar of knowledge, we are usually talking about learning. Also, this process involves error correction and explicit instruction.
Now, we are going to compare the teacher and student's point of view about how they see the acquisition and learning in the class. Let's start with the teacher. In the acquisition, he sends comprehensible messages. L2 is used to talk about content. There is an emergent speech and self-motivating. The early production and practice are not required. The giving information is informal but planned. In the other hand, in learning, teacher explain grammar rules, make long explanations in English. The grammar is seen as a subject matter. English is used to talk about L2 rules, and there is a forced speech. Now let's analyze the student's point of view. In the acquisition, they only want to listen and produce grammatical utterances, and they have their attention in the message. Also, students acquire actual language, but something important is the attitude and the attendance because they are crucial for their developing. Meanwhile, in learning, they must respond, memorize, and follow grammar rules and make long planned answers. Their attention is on the structures, and they are forced to speak the target language, and students who can understand work with smart students.
How is output and input seen in acquisition and learning? So, what is input? Input might be viewed as all the exposure to the target language that is around us. The input is important because without it there cannot be output. In short, If you don't hear or see the language, then you can learn it. Acquisition requires meaningful interaction in the target language natural communication. This hypothesis acknowledges that students learn faster as they are given more comprehensible input. This term essentially means messages that can be understood. The input that is a little bit beyond the student's current level but is still comprehensible is considered the best type of input. This kind of input is best received when the learner is hearing something that he or she wants or needs to know. Learning focuses on the output that results from formal language instruction of grammar rules and practice. This output is forced above the level of acquisition. Therefore, it won't help learners to acquire language because output doesn't cause proficiency, input does.
Now let's talk about some of the criticisms towards this hypothesis. This section presents a review of Krashen acquisition learning hypothesis. 5 weaknesses of the hypothesis are discussed here. Regardless of the criticisms of this theory, the classification of topics and questions that the model offers is especially valuable. It is a model that provides a synthesis that allows organizing ideas in this regard. But there are also criticisms of Krashen's theories. Now here we notice 5 that say that Krashen is not the first to make a distinction between acquisition and learning. Secondly, the hypothesis cannot be tested empirically, and acquisition and learning are not entirely separate, and learning is used not only as a monitor but also as an aid to comprehension. It is premature to assume that adults acquire language in the same way as children do. So the acquisition could be better understood when described as a process enriched by the learner system, instead of drawing a borderline separating acquisition and learning into 2 discrete disciplines. The cross currents of both the system constantly. Many critics feel that Krashen has postulated a model without properly explaining its many variations and functions, thus rendering it unsatisfactory when empirically tested. But such constant change, modification, and revisions can frustrate both the researchers and teachers interested in using this model. Had Krashen taken that into account, he might have been able to propose a more testable, viable, and usable monitor. However, the vagueness of the terminology used by Krashen has not escaped criticism. Strictly speaking, what he exactly means by terms such as acquisition learning, subconscious or conscious, implicit, and explicit is hard to ascertain. It is not surprising that a need for definitional accuracy is widely felt, but Krashen remains less perturbed by that. It is also difficult to perceive how acquisition and learning, how used in 2 separate linguistic systems, could be put into the use by learners by L2 learners. So that learning cannot turn into acquisition is another contentious issue. On the other hand, Castrillo mentions that the activities to be carried out should not be based on the target language. He says that, on the contrary, they should focus on solving problems or tasks that are provided to students through meaning and not to the form of the language. The activities that mentioned are 3 types, for example, information activities, opinion activities, and reasoning activities.
Application in the classroom. Minimize explicit grammar. It means keeping the acquisition or learning distinction in mind and go light on explicit teaching and learning of grammar, especially with younger students. Emphasize acquisition over learning. It means focusing on acquisition-based activities, input above output. Focus on the message. It means remembering that practice looks different under the acquisition model.
Now it's time for the team's conclusion.
Well, I have to say that the distinction between learning and acquisition is very important to do. Like we said before, Krashen says that learning cannot become acquisition, and I agree with him because I believe that the acquisition or the level of acquisition will depend on many factors, like the willingness learner to acquire the language. Moreover, I think that if we get immersed into the language, we will acquire it at some point. However, sometimes learners don't have enough motivation to acquire the language, and this can lead them to fossilize the knowledge that they acquired before. This means that maybe will not acquire the language at the same level as a native speaker. And another thing that I have to say is that one thing that caught my attention was that Krashen says that the comprehensive input is essential. He says that with this kind of input, learners will acquire the language naturally rather than consciously, like learning. For example, if the teacher exposes the learners to slightly more advanced level rather than the level that they are, this will help students to explore the language, and therefore they will acquire it because they are actually exploring the language without being aware about that. So you can explore the language because you are really interested in. So I believe that the input is really important. Most of all, meaningful input, because sometimes we forget about the meaning. We only focus on the grammar rules. And yeah, I believe that this hypothesis is really interesting, and I totally agree with Krashen on this.
Okay, in my case, while I was reading the points of view or the consequence that this distinction between acquisition and learning has in the students and the teachers, I feel identified with the learning because, like we saw in the video, learning is only repeat, acquire, review grammar rules, so the student can't speak in a current way, and I feel so identified with that. And yes, I think that in my case, I only learned the language, but I don't have acquired at all. So it's very interesting, this theory, and I think that is right, even that there are no evidence, and for that reason many linguistics has criticized this theory, but it's a very interesting theory, like I said before, and I want to apply in my future class.
Yes, in my case, from what I've been reading, this hypothesis by Krashen, it's very interesting, as you say, and accurate. And I fully agree with Krashen's position because he makes this difference between acquisition and learning. And of course, I completely agree with him. And like Kine said, we certainly noticed in your own experience with language that we are learning, and this both different. Because, for example, when you only acquire, maybe you only are listening, or when you listen songs or movies or series. But when you start to learning the language and you put together the acquisition and the learning, and you start to study the morphology or the phonetic of this language more deeply, then you can have this language completely in your process, and then you can acquire better. But it's important to pay attention to this difference that Krashen do, and I completely agree with him. So it's very logic, this theory.
Okay, in my opinion, I have 2 points about this Krashen's hypothesis. In the first one, I disagree with him in the part that he said learned language cannot be turned into acquisition, because if we are learning a language, we have to learn it completely, not just in grammar, in how to speak it, write something. And at the end, we can acquire that language as our own language. And in the second point, I agree with him in the part that we don't have to spend a lot of time in learning grammar rules, because we, as I said before, we have to learn it completely, like not just in grammar. And
we have to, if we are in a foreign culture, we have to use it appropriately. And yes, I think that's it.
Well, I can conclude that Krashen mentioned that there are two different processes about the language, and as we can see, there are many criticisms for linguists because Krashen doesn't define certain terms, and this make it difficult to understand the hypothesis. For example, what still causes me doubt is the fact that for Krashen, learning never transforms into acquisition, and this would mean that for him, formal teaching would be a failure for acquisition. But for me, knowing a bit about grammar plays an important role in the acquisition process, and this shouldn't be eliminated. And finally, I think this hypothesis is so interesting in this class.
Well, finally, in this session, we can see a lot of different point of views, but all of you, we are agree with this hypothesis. We talk about one of the five hypotheses that Krashen provide in their studies. And well, finally, we can conclude that it's really important to know about this, even if it's not a theory, it's just a hypothesis, but have critics, of course. But for all of you, it's important to acquire this knowledge and apply to your students, because in the future can provide this to your students, and then they can acquire their target language. So I hope everyone have enjoyed this small discussion and learn more about this. So thank you for watching.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.